The air along the Spanish-Portuguese border in May 1811 was not filled with the scent of spring wildflowers, but with the acrid, choking dust of 50,000 marching men. Here, on the scorched plains west of Salamanca, the relentless sun beat down upon a sleepy, obscure village of stone cottages and winding alleys. Its name was Fuentes de Oñoro. Within 48 hours, this quiet hamlet would be transformed from a simple farming community into a slaughterhouse, etched forever into the annals of the British Army. The stage was set for a confrontation that was as personal as it was strategic, a duel between the Iron Duke of the British Empire and the desperate, aging lion of the French Republic. To the east, looming like a storm front, approached the army of Portugal under Marshal André Massena. Known to history and his emperor as the dear child of victory, Massena was one of the most celebrated military minds of the age. Yet, as he stared through his telescope at the British lines, he was a man fighting for his professional life. His invasion of Portugal had stalled, his troops were starving, and his reputation was fraying. The fortress of Almeida, garrisoned by French troops, was under siege by the British. If Massena could not break through to relieve it, his failure would be absolute. He brought with him a terrifying force of 42,000 seasoned infantry, 4,500 cavalry, and 38 guns. They were hungry, they were angry, and they were desperate to drive the British into the sea. Standing in his way was Arthur Wellesley, Viscount Wellington. With an Anglo-Portuguese force of 34,000 infantry, significantly outnumbered by the French, Wellington had taken up a defensive position that relied heavily on the terrain. He anchored his line on the village of Fuentes de Oñoro itself, using the stone walls and the rocky ravine of the Dos Casas stream as a natural moat. Wellington knew the odds. He knew that Massena possessed a significant advantage in cavalry, a deadly threat on the open plains that flanked the village. Yet, with the icy calculation that defined his career, Wellington chose to stand. He placed his trust in the discipline of his redcoats and the grit of his Portuguese allies to hold the line against the coming tide. The violence began on the afternoon of May 3rd. Massena, impatient and underestimating the tenacity of the defenders, ordered a frontal assault directly against the village. He believed that a sharp, brutal shock would shatter the British resolve before the main battle lines were even fully drawn. French columns, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur," surged forward, their blue coats swarming towards the stone barricades erected in the narrow streets. Waiting for them were the 71st Highland Light Infantry and the 79th Cameron Highlanders. As the French burst into the village, they were met not with panic, but with the disciplined, rhythmic crash of British musketry. The fighting immediately devolved into a savage, close-quarters brawl. In the confined alleys, where the grand maneuvers of open warfare were impossible, the battle became a test of individual courage. Bayonets scraped against stone, musket butts shattered doors, the air filled with the roar of combat, the screams of the wounded, and the piercing skirl of the bagpipes, which wailed above the din to rally the Highlanders. For hours, the control of the village swung back and forth like a pendulum. The French, utilizing their numbers, pushed the Highlanders back through the tangled maze of houses, only to be thrown back out by ferocious countercharges. The Dos Casas stream ran red, choked with the bodies of men who had died fighting for a few yards of cobblestone. By nightfall, the British still held the upper village, forcing Massena to call off the attack. The dear child of victory had been bloodied, his initial gamble a failure. But as the smoke cleared and the sun set on May 3rd, both commanders knew this was merely the prelude. Massena had tested the centre and found it hard as granite. Now, his eyes turned toward the open plains to the south and the exposed British right flank. May 4th dawned with a deceptive calm, a silence that hung heavy over the sun-baked fields. It was a day of watching, of waiting, and of deadly calculation. While the wounded in the village of Fuentes de Oñoro cried out for water, Marshal Massena spent the hours prowling the front lines. He rode south, away from the stone walls that had broken his infantry the day before, and turned his gaze toward the hamlet of Pozzobello. What he saw there surely brought a grim smile to his face. Wellington, in his necessity to cover all possible roads leading to the besieged fortress of Almeida, had been forced to stretch his line until it was dangerously thin. Anchoring this precarious right flank was the British 7th Division, a formation isolated and exposed on the flat, open ground near Pozzobello. To a commander of Massena's experience, the opportunity was glaring. The terrain here was not the rocky, defensible scrub of the village. It was a broad plain, perfectly suited for the maneuvering of heavy horses. Massena knew the arithmetic of the battlefield better than anyone. He possessed 4,500 veteran cavalrymen, dragoons, hussars, and chasseurs, against Wellington's paltry force of barely 1,800 sabres. The board was set for a massacre. If Massena could smash the 7th Division, he could roll up the entire British line from the side, trapping Wellington against the river and destroying his army. As the sun rose on May 5th, the false peace shattered. The ground began to tremble, a low rumble that grew into a thunderous roar as General Montbrun, arguably the finest cavalry commander in the French army, unleashed the full weight of the French mounted arm. It was a terrifying spectacle. Thousands of horsemen, their cuirasses and sabres glinting in the morning light, swept across the plain like a steel tide. The dust kicked up by 20,000 hooves created a suffocating, blinding fog, through which the British defenders could see only the terrifying shapes of oncoming death. The British cavalry, though vastly outnumbered, rode out to meet them with desperate bravery. Regiments like the 14th Light Dragoons and the Royals threw themselves against the French masses, attempting to buy time for the infantry to form up. But courage alone could not alter the physics of mass and momentum. The British horsemen were engulfed, fighting swirling, isolated skirmishes against a sea of French dragoons. They were steadily driven back, leaving the infantry of the 7th Division naked before the storm. Inside the ranks of the 7th Division, the tension was agonizing. These men watched as their cavalry screen evaporated, leaving nothing between them and Montbrun's charging squadrons. French artillery, galloping forward with the speed of the horsemen, unlimbered and began to pour fire into the British ranks. Round shot ploughed through the files of redcoats, tearing limbs and shattering discipline. The village of Pozzobello, occupied by a small advanced guard, was quickly overrun. The defenders swarmed by the sheer number of French attackers. Wellington, watching from his command post, realized instantly that the crisis of the battle had arrived. His right flank was crumbling. The 7th Division was in imminent danger of being cut off and annihilated, an event that would almost certainly lead to the total defeat of his army. The decision he made next was one of the hardest of his career. He could not send enough reinforcements to hold the ground at Pozzobello. The numbers simply weren't there. Instead, he had to do something far more difficult. He had to order the 7th Division to give up the ground, to retreat across the open plain in the face of a triumphant enemy cavalry, and to realign his entire army by 90 degrees while under fire. It was a maneuver that would have tested soldiers on a parade ground in London. Attempting it here, amidst the chaos of battle and the roar of French guns, seemed suicidal. To cover this perilous withdrawal, Wellington turned to his elite, the Light Division. Under the command of the stern and uncompromising General Robert Crawford, known to his men as Black Bob, the Light Division was ordered to move out onto the plain. Their mission was to act as a human shield, to march into the teeth of the French cavalry and shepherd their battered comrades to safety. As Crawford's men stepped off, marching with rifle-green precision into the dust clouds, they were walking into a trap from which few expected to return. What followed was one of the most surreal and terrifying spectacles of the Napoleonic Wars. As the Light Division marched onto the plain, they did not form a solid line of battle. Instead, they broke into a series of battalion squares, geometric fortresses of human flesh and steel. The 43rd, the 52nd, and the riflemen of the 95th halted, turned, and locked ranks. The front rank knelt, bracing the butts of their muskets against the ground, presenting a hedge of bayonets that no horse would willingly charge. The rear rank stood ready to fire. In the vast, open expanse, These squares looked pitifully small, tiny islands of red and green adrift in a violently churning sea of French blue. General Robert Crawford, a man of terrifying temper and exacting standards, rode among them. His presence alone was a steel spine for the soldiers. He knew, as every private in the ranks knew, that survival depended entirely on discipline. If a single man flinched, if a single company broke ranks to run, the French dragoons would pour into the gap and hack the regiment to pieces within seconds. The instinct to flee from the thundering wall of heavy cavalry was primal, overwhelming. Yet the light division did not run, they walked. The retreat was a slow, agonizing ballet of death. The squares would march a short distance, the men sweating in their heavy wool coats under the Spanish sun. Then, at the sound of a drum or a shouted command, they would halt and brace as the French cavalry swept in. The French horsemen, frustrated and shouting insults, rode right up to the bayonet points, firing pistols and slashing at the air, trying to provoke the British into firing a premature volley. They knew that once the muskets were empty, the square was vulnerable. But the redcoats held their fire, their discipline absolute. They waited until the horses were nearly upon them, then unleashed a rolling volley of musketry that emptied saddles and sent the French reeling back in confusion. As the withdrawal continued for miles across the plain, the dust became a protagonist in the battle. The thousands of hooves pulverized the dry earth, kicking up a blinding, choking cloud that swallowed the combatants whole. To distant observers on the high ground, the light division effectively vanished. They could see only a vast brown fog bank moving slowly across the landscape. Occasionally, the wind would shift, or the dust would settle for a moment, revealing the glint of bayonets or the top of a shako, looking, as one witness famously described, like ships in a sea of dust. Inside that cloud, the world was a claustrophobic nightmare of noise and heat. The soldiers could see little beyond the backs of their comrades, or the flashing sabres of the enemy appearing suddenly out of the haze. The 7th Division, battered and exhausted, managed to limp to safety behind this shield, their retreat covered by the stoic rearguard. But the danger was constant. Whenever the French cavalry massed for a decisive strike, the outnumbered British and German cavalry of the King's German Legion would launch desperate, suicidal charges to disrupt them, buying precious seconds for the infantry to close up their ranks. The psychological strain was immense. For hours, the infantry marched with death literally breathing down their necks. Yet, the moving squares never broke. They traversed the open plain, harassed every step of the way by the finest cavalry in Europe, and suffered negligible casualties. It was a triumph of drill over brute force, a demonstration of the professional supremacy of Wellington's infantry. But just as it seemed the British might extract themselves from the trap, a sudden gap opened in the chaos. A troop of British horse artillery, commanded by Captain Norman Ramsay, had stayed behind too long to cover the retreat. As the dust swirled, the French chasseurs realized the guns were isolated. With a triumphant roar, the French cavalry surged forward, surrounding Ramsay's position and cutting him off from the rest of the army. The British line watched in horror, assuming the guns and their brave crews were lost forever. To the watching infantry of the Light Division, the fate of Captain Norman Ramsay's troop seemed sealed. The swirling dust cloud that had swallowed the artillerymen was thick with the dark uniforms of French chasseurs. There was no firing from within the mass, only the chaotic din of shouting men and the clash of steel. The British officers lowered their telescopes, resigned to the loss of the precious 6-pounder guns and the capture of their comrades. In the brutal arithmetic of war, artillery caught limbered on an open plain by cavalry was considered already dead. There was no precedent for escape. The physics of heavy iron carriages and draft horses simply did not allow for it. But the Royal Horse Artillery was no ordinary unit. They were the flying artillery, an elite corps where every man was mounted, trained to move at the speed of a galloping hunt. Inside the suffocating ring of French steel, Captain Ramsay did not signal surrender. Instead, he gave a command that defied sanity. He ordered his drivers to whip their horses into a frenzy. They were not going to yield. They were going to charge. What happened next became the single most legendary image of the Battle of Fuentes de Oñoro. From the center of the swirling French mass, a sudden, violent commotion erupted. The density of the dust cloud seemed to bulge outward, pulsing with kinetic energy. Then, with a roar that drowned out the musketry, the trap burst open. Ramsay appeared at the head of the column, his saber flashing, riding at a full gallop. Behind him, the teams of powerful artillery horses, nostrils flared and chests heaving, stretched out into a run usually reserved for the racecourse. The heavy guns bounded and leaped over the uneven ground, their iron-shod wheels spinning in a blur. The gunners, mounted on their own chargers, rode knee to knee, hacking left and right at the stunned French cavalrymen who tried to bar their path. It was a thunderbolt of blue and gold uniforms tearing through the enemy line. The French chasseurs, expecting a meek surrender, were caught completely off guard by the ferocity of the breakout. They spurred their mounts to close the gap, slashing at the traces and the drivers, but the momentum of the British charge was unstoppable. The artillery train acted like a battering ram. Ramsay's troops smashed through the encirclement, the guns careening wildly but remaining upright, the drivers plying their whips with desperate strength. As the troop burst free from the dust and galloped toward the safety of the British lines, a spontaneous, ragged cheer erupted from the nearby infantry squares. It was a cry of pure disbelief and admiration. The brother-in-arms of the Light Division, seeing their artillerymen escape certain death, waved their shakos in the air. Ramsay brought his guns around, unlimbered with practiced speed, and immediately opened fire on the very cavalry that had just held him captive. The French pursuit was checked by a wall of canister shot, forcing them to wheel away. With the miraculous escape of the guns and the successful withdrawal of the Light Division, the crisis on the right flank began to stabilize. Wellington's gamble had paid off. He had successfully refused the flank, bending his line back at a 90-degree angle to refuse the French the advantage. The moving squares halted on the new defensive line, exhausted but unbroken. Massena's grand flanking maneuver, led by the flower of his cavalry, had been frustrated by the iron discipline of the British infantry and the sheer audacity of a single artillery captain. Massena, watching from the heights, was furious. His masterstroke had failed. The British line had bent, but it had not broken. The open plain, where his cavalry should have won the day, was now a stalemate. He realized that if he wanted to break Wellington, he could not do it by maneuvering in the open. He would have to go back to where the battle had started. He would have to go back to the slaughterhouse. His eyes turned once again to the village of Fuentes de Oñoro, where the Highlander regiments were still holding the lower streets. The battle would not be decided by brilliant cavalry charges, but by the bloody work of the bayonet in the gutters of the village. While the dust settled on the plain, the village of Fuentes de Oñoro erupted into a renewed frenzy of violence. Massena, frustrated by the tactical stalemate on the flank, poured his rage into the center. He ordered Drouet's division, thousands of fresh French infantrymen, to take the village at any cost. The objective was simple: smash through the stone houses, seize the church at the summit of the village, and break the British line in two. What followed was not a battle of maneuvers, but a grinding industrial slaughter within the confines of a few hundred square yards. The defenders, the 71st Highland Light Infantry and the 79th Cameron Highlanders, were already exhausted from days of skirmishing. Now, they faced a tsunami of blue coats. The French columns slammed into the lower streets with the weight of a sledgehammer. The fighting here was stripped of all glory. It was intimate and horrific. In the narrow, winding alleys, muskets were often too long to reload, so men used them as clubs. Bayonets were driven into bodies at point-blank range. The air in the village became a toxic soup of black powder smoke, trapped between the stone walls, blinding the combatants until they were fighting shadows. Slowly, agonizingly, the sheer weight of French numbers began to tell. The Highlanders were forced back, house by house, alley by alley. Every stone wall became a temporary fortress, held until the ammunition ran low, or the French flankers threatened to cut them off. The combat spilled into the village cemetery, where men fought and died among the tombstones of the Spanish dead. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of shouting, the splintering of wood, and the constant rolling roar of musketry that echoed off the church walls. It was in this cauldron of chaos that a pivotal tragedy occurred. Lieutenant Colonel Phillips Cameron, the beloved commander of the 79th Highlanders, was leading his men near the canal when a French bullet found him. He fell from his horse, mortally wounded. As the news of their commander's fall rippled through the ranks, a strange and terrifying transformation overtook the Highlanders. Instead of demoralizing them, the loss of Cameron sent them into a paroxysm of rage. A roar of Gaelic fury rose from the smoke-filled streets. The 79th did not retreat. They charged. Ignoring all order, they threw themselves at the French grenadiers in a frenzy of vengeance, their bayonets working grimly. For a moment, the French advance faltered in the face of this emotional counterattack. But emotions could not hold back the tide forever. The French reserves pushed forward, stepping over piles of their own dead to drive the British further up the hill. The Highlanders, depleted and bloodied, were finally forced out of the tangle of streets and onto the plateau near the church at the top of the village. The French swarmed into the lower buildings, their sharpshooters taking up positions in the windows, firing up at the exposed British line. From his position on the ridge, Wellington watched the deterioration of the village defence with a stony expression. He saw the 79th and 71st staggering back, their ranks thinned, their officers dead or wounded. The village, the anchor of his entire position, was slipping away. If the French could establish artillery on that hill, they could enfilade his entire army. The crisis had shifted from the right flank directly to his front door. Wellington turned to his reserve. Waiting in the wings were the 74th Highlanders, and perhaps more significantly, the 88th Regiment of Foot, the Connaught Rangers. The 88th were an Irish regiment with a fearsome reputation. They were known for being difficult to discipline in camp, wild and unruly, but in the heat of battle, they were unmatched shock troops. Wellington famously remarked that he didn't know what effect they had on the enemy, but they certainly terrified him. Now he needed that terror. He ordered the 88th and the 74th to fix bayonets. They were to retake the village. There would be no firing, no skirmishing. They were to go in with cold steel and drive the French into the river. The 88th. Connaught Rangers were a rough breed. Recruited from the harsh, windswept counties of Western Ireland, they were men who had known little comfort in their lives, and they fought with a terrifying, reckless abandon. As they crested the ridge, looking down into the smoke-choked inferno of the village, there was no hesitation. They were fresh, they were angry, and they had been unleashed. Alongside them marched the steady, disciplined ranks of the 74th Highlanders. The order was given: advance at the double, no firing, charge. They hit the French vanguard like a runaway train. Disregarding the musket fire snapping around them from the windows and rooftops, the Rangers surged into the upper streets with a momentum that defied physics. They did not stop to return fire. They simply ran at the enemy, bayonets levelled at waist height. The French grenadiers, who had spent hours grinding down the stubborn resistance of the 79th and believed the battle effectively won, were suddenly confronted by a screaming wall of red coats emerging from the smoke. The impact was cataclysmic. In the confined, suffocating alleys of Fuentes de Oñoro, the superior numbers of the French army counted for nothing against the sheer, kinetic ferocity of the counterattack. The Rangers fought with a brutal intimacy, clearing houses room by room, driving the enemy out of doorways and hunting them down in the cellars. It was a melee of rifle butts and 17-inch bayonets. The 74th Highlanders, moving in grim support, added their weight to the crush, sealing off side streets and ensuring no French unit could rally. The psychological shock was too much for Masséna's exhausted infantry. The cohesion of the French columns shattered. Panic, which had been kept at bay by the discipline of the veterans, finally took hold. The blue-clad infantry turned and fled down the slope, a disorganized mob pouring through the narrow streets they had fought so hard to conquer only an hour before. They were pursued closely by the stabbing steel of the British, driven back over the shattered barricades, back through the desecrated cemetery, and finally, splashing desperately across the crimson waters of the Dos Casas stream. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, The village of Fuentes de Oñoro was British once more. The streets were choked with the debris of war, shattered carts, discarded muskets, and the intermingled bodies of the fallen from 3 nations. The 88th and the 74th established positions at the water's edge, glaring across the ravine at the French army. There would be no further assaults. The ferocity of the Irish charge had broken the spirit of the attack. From his command post on the heights, Marshal Masséna lowered his telescope. The scene below was a tableau of failure. He had thrown his finest cavalry against the British right and had been checked by the miracle of the squares. He had thrown his best infantry against the centre and had been hurled back by the bayonet. The gamble had failed. The fortress of Almeida would not be relieved. The dear child of victory sat in silence, knowing that with the setting sun, his career as a Marshal of France was effectively ending. He had met the Sepoy general, and he had blinked. As darkness finally fell on May 5th, a heavy, unnatural silence descended upon the plain of Fuentes de Oñoro. The roaring of the cannons and the screaming of men were replaced by the low, mournful sounds of the aftermath, the groans of the wounded abandoned in the no-man's land between the armies, the clink of shovels as burial parties began their grim work, and the murmuring of exhausted soldiers trying to make sense of the day's violence. The cost of holding the line had been steep. The British and Portuguese army had suffered nearly 1,500 casualties, men killed, wounded, or missing. The French losses were even higher, with over 2,200 men stricken from the rolls. But numbers on a page could not capture the reality of the battlefield. The village itself was a charnel house. The stone cottages were pockmarked with musket balls, the streets were slick with blood, and the Dos Casas stream, the tactical dividing line, was choked with corpses. For Wellington, the victory was bitter. He wrote privately to his brother, "If Boney had been there, we should have been beat." It was an admission of just how close disaster had come. The battle had not been won by brilliant strategic maneuvers or clever flanking attacks. It had been won by the sheer, stubborn refusal of the British soldier to break. It was won by the Light Division, marching calmly through a storm of cavalry, by Ramsay's gunners driving their horses through a wall of enemies, and by the Highlanders and Irishmen who turned the streets of a Spanish village into a graveyard for the French Empire. Masséna lingered for 2 more days, hoping Wellington might make a mistake, but the Iron Duke did not move. He remained entrenched, his army a coiled spring waiting for the next attack. Finally, realizing the futility of further bloodshed, Masséna ordered the retreat. His army turned its back on Portugal and limped away into Spain. The garrison at Almeida, seeing their relief force vanish over the horizon, managed a daring breakout of their own, blowing up the fortress before slipping through the British blockade. A final stinging embarrassment for Wellington in an otherwise victorious campaign. But the strategic result was undeniable. Portugal was secure. The French invasion had been definitively stopped. And for André Masséna, the consequences were personal and absolute. Napoleon, unforgiving of failure, stripped him of his command. The Marshal, who had once been the Emperor's right hand, the hero of Rivoli and Zurich, was sent into disgrace, never to command a major army again. He was replaced by Marshal Marmont, a younger, untested commander. The old guard of the Grande Armée was being ground down, battle by the relentless attrition of the Peninsular War. Fuentes de Oñoro was not a masterpiece of generalship like Salamanca, or a crushing rout like Vitoria. It was a soldier's battle. It was a messy, chaotic, near disaster that was salvaged by the grit of the rank and file. It proved that on a good day, the British infantry could stand in the open against the best cavalry in the world and survive. It proved that they could lose a village and take it back with cold steel. It was an ugly, brutal fight, but it was the fight that broke the back of the French marshals. In the grand tapestry of the Napoleonic Wars, Fuentes de Oñoro is often overshadowed by the more decisive triumphs of Salamanca or the carnage of Waterloo. It lacks the sweeping, masterful maneuvers that military academies teach as examples of tactical genius. Yet, in the history of the British Army, it holds a sacred, almost mythical place. It stands as the ultimate testament to the resilience of the Redcoat. It was a battle where the generalship faltered, where the plan went wrong, and where the army was saved not by the mind of its commander, but by the heart of its soldiers. The legacy of those 3 days in May 1811 echoed long after the last French boot crossed the horizon. For the French Empire, it was a stark warning. The Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon called the Peninsular War, was becoming a gangrenous wound that refused to heal. Massena's failure proved that the French war machine, so dominant across the plains of Central Europe, had lost its momentum. The Marshals, the demigods of the Revolution, were being humbled one by a stern aristocrat from Dublin and his scum-of-the-earth soldiers. The aura of invincibility that had cloaked the Grande Armée was stripped away in the dusty streets of a Spanish village. For the specific units involved, Fuentes de Oñoro became a badge of supreme honor. The story of the Light Division's retreat across the plain, the moving squares, became a legend of discipline, a standard against which future infantrymen would be measured for a century. It demonstrated that a calm head and a steady musket could defy the most terrifying force on the battlefield. And then there was Norman Ramsay. The image of the lone artillery captain bursting through the mass of French cavalry, his horses foaming and his sabre swinging, was immortalized in military lore. It became the defining spirit of the Royal Horse Artillery: speed, aggression, and a refusal to accept the impossible. Tragically, Ramsay would not survive the war. He would fall 4 years later on the fields of Waterloo, but his charge at Fuentes de Oñoro ensured his name would never be forgotten. For Wellington, the battle was a lesson in humility and a validation of his trust in his men. He never claimed it was a masterpiece. In his dispatches, he was characteristically blunt about the risks he had run. But he also knew that he possessed an instrument of war that was becoming sharper with every engagement. He had an army that could be outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and outgunned, and yet, quite simply, refused to be beaten. Today, the village of Fuentes de Oñoro has returned to the quiet obscurity from which it was dragged in 1811. The stone walls that were once barricades are now garden fences. The church that served as a fortress is a place of peaceful worship. But if one walks the dusty plain to the south, or stands by the rocky banks of the Dos Casas stream, the geography of the slaughter is still visible. It is easy to imagine the heat, the blinding dust, and the ships in a sea of dust, marching steadily away from destruction. The battle was the breaking point of the French offensive in Portugal. It marked the moment when the tide turned definitively toward the Pyrenees and the French border. It was a victory won by the tenacity of the 79th Highlanders, the fury of the 88th Connaught Rangers, and the iron nerve of the Light Division. It was the day the British Army looked defeat in the eye and did not blink. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.